Hello, everybody. I am Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute, an independent think tank in Washington, D.C. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce two very distinguished speakers today. I could give long introductions of their government service and their publications and academic accomplishments. I will give a very telegraphic, but to us at the Kennan Institute, um, very pleasurable introduction, which is to say that Pavlo Klimkin and Rose Gottemoeller are both members of the Kennan Institute Advisory Council. With that brief and telegraphic introduction, I'd like to begin today's conversation. I will say to the audience that we will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and we would very much welcome your questions, but you have to send them to the Q&A function of this webinar. I'm sure you're familiar with that, and then I will take a look at the questions and then pose them to our two speakers. But we'll start with a few questions of my own. I'd like to go back in time to a fairly famous episode. It can seem like it was years ago, but it was in fact only 7-8 months ago, and that's February of 2025 when the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a trip to Washington and had a fairly standard meeting in the Oval Office until it became something of a international spectacle with a unusually high degree of openly expressed disagreement between the Ukrainian president and the American president and vice president. That was, of course, 1 month into the second Trump term and seemed to define things in a very clear way at that moment. And yet it's been a very indirect or wavy line from that moment to the present. So I'd like to start with you, Rose, and to kind of go back in time a little bit. And of course, we have the Alaska summit between Presidents Trump and Putin also in fairly recent memory, and just ask for a sense of, in your eyes, how we got to the moment where we are now. Is there a direct line from that White House meeting to the present moment, or do you see it as I do, as quite wavy and at times, kind of bending around corners and at sharp angles?
No, it's been quite a roller coaster ride, I would say, which goes along with your description of a wavy process. And on that occasion, I really thought the worst of the White House urge to put everything on the front page of the newspaper as fast as possible was on display, because it was just unprecedented for, in an Oval Office meeting, that amount of public scrapping to be going on. And it was unfortunate in so many ways, just in my view, not the way to conduct diplomacy. We'll be talking about that more this morning, but to have everything out in the public eye in that way. And it was a disastrous scene. But it did do something, I think, very important, which was to wake up the NATO allies, to wake up the Europeans to the necessity of really bolstering the position that Ukraine is in, and the position of the Ukrainian president, President Zelensky, and to really try to do everything they can to steer the conversations between Kyiv and Washington, and to help the process of diplomacy move in the right direction and not in a disastrous direction. So I think that was a very important point. That very next weekend, the phones were ringing off the hook. Apparently a lot of interaction with President Zelensky in Kyiv, as well as with President Trump in Washington. And I think that that methodology, that process, continues to serve us well to this day in this latest episode.
It is interesting how there does seem to be a process that kicked into gear almost immediately, as you described, Rose, in February, and we can, as we will shortly, pick apart that process in the last couple of days. Let's turn now to you, Pavlo, for some reflections on. It's not deep history, but you could say the history of the last 8-9 months and the passage from the very beginning of the second Trump term to the present moment.
Good evening from Kiev. It's actually good morning in American terms. Anyway, look, I believe that roller coaster has been there and will be there for some time. So it's something which is the nature of what I would call personalized diplomacy. Now it's less institutional impact and more personal impact. Secondly, I believe that strategically the key goals for the US president, have not changed. And the first one for me is to start the process of ending combat actions and actually to end them and also to take credit for that. Secondly is to offload as much as possible responsibility for the European security to Europe, which is actually quite natural, but the point is how to get there. And third is to try to normalize relations with Russia and with Putin, which is not the same, actually. So more or less, these goals are still there. But understanding what is at stake, understanding what matters around the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And it's not just about security, it's mainly about 2 points. It's about sovereignty and identity. Is coming in. Too slow, but is coming in. It's what my sense is. Second, I don't believe that the Russian goals and personally Putin's goals have changed. And I don't believe they will change. Strategy, yes, maybe. Tactics could also change, but not the goals, in the sense that independent and European Ukraine is not something they can accept. It's what I understand, and it's what kind of reflects my best knowledge there. On Europe, I fully agree with Rose. Europe, firstly, started understanding, again, too slow and too fragmented, that the Russian threat and what Russia has been doing is serious. Serious in the sense of a direct threat to the European security, not just to Ukraine. And second point, and it started coming probably some months ago, is that Europe got that it's also durable. It's now both serious and durable for Europe. It's not really coming at the level of people with all kind of sympathy towards Ukraine, but it's coming for many politicians, policymakers, experts, militaries. So this understanding is getting there. And it's where we are in the sense of key strategic points. Of course, oversimplifying it. And let me just say that for us, there are 4 fundamental areas where we believe Russia wants to limit, to restrain our sovereignty. One is territory. Second is about our domestic policy and about trying to impact our domestic policy directly and indirectly. Third, it's about our foreign policy choice, what to do, how to do, and to do or not to do it all. And the fourth point, to limit our defense capabilities. It's our defense sovereignty. It's not only in the sense of quantitative limitations for our militaries, but also in the sense of types of weapons, of delivering intel, delivering logistics, and all kind of stuff. So it's a kind of reality we are now, and this reality has been changing, but not kind of not kind of in the way that we have a game changer now.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to you, Rose, and to your notion of a process, the kind of inklings of it that were there in February, and we have more evidence to understand this process now over the past several months. And so in two respects, I'd sort of like to ask a two-part question. So Pavlo mentioned a moment ago the motivations of the Russian Federation as he understands them, which are in effect for efforts to constrain and control Ukrainian sovereignty. I would like to ask if you agree with that, and also the paraphrase that Pavlo offered of Trump administration objectives to turn, in effect, from Europe to kind of take credit for a diplomatic solution and presumably to sort of move on to other issues that are out there. So one part of the question is just to ask you to respond to that and to make sure that you either, or to see if you agree or disagree on those points. And the second part of the question, I'd like you to comment on, sort of European motivations here and Ukrainian motivations as you see them. And of course, Pavlo will then turn to you to comment on Ukrainian motivations from Kiev, and to speak a bit more about where Europe is trying to take this rather anarchic process that we have before our eyes. So back over to you, Rose.
All right, those are some complex questions. I'll do my best, but absolutely, for the Ukrainians, the motivation is survival. And they have been fighting for their lives. Started in 2014 with the first invasion of Ukraine, when Crimea was seized and the Donbass was destabilized. And now, since February 2022, this intense war of aggression that Russia undertook, that Vladimir Putin undertook. By the way, Pavlo, I agree with you that policy toward Russia and policy toward Putin are two different things. So I hope we can tease that out some in this conversation, because I think that's a really important point. But first of all, I want to say that I do agree that there has been this tendency in the Trump administration, and we heard it very, very early from Pete Hegseth when he first went to Europe in February. All this was happening in February, right? When he said to the NATO allies and to the European partners of the United States, we expect you now to defend yourself conventionally. We will sustain and maintain the extended nuclear deterrent, but it's up to you to defend yourselves. And that has really informed, I think, the policy of the Trump administration up to this time. That said, what is very important about this diplomatic initiative, this campaign that the European leaders undertook, which was so important last February in standing with the Ukrainians and turning the Trump administration from what I consider to be a disastrous path of abandoning the Ukrainians in favor of Russia. On that occasion, I think that there was a new kind of, it's a strange word to say, perhaps, but a new kind of bond was forged between Washington and the European capitals, in that Trump ceased to be so threatening. There were things going on inside NATO, too, that were important, like the summit meeting in The Hague this summer, when NATO agreed to 5% of GDP expenditure on defense, so 3.5% on acquiring new military capabilities, and then additional 1.5% on military-related infrastructure. So that was a big step that satisfied, I think, some of the complaints that Trump has had about NATO, that they were free-riding, that they were taking advantage of the United States, et cetera. So that was a factor in this bonding process that went on. But I also think that Trump is a very personalist leader, and he likes to get to know people. He likes to be able to pick up the phone and call them. And I think the European leaders have gotten that, and many of them have cultivated that with the president. And so there is, I think, a willingness now to engage between Washington and the European capitals in a way that was not there as I saw it in the first administration. Some leaders got it. My boss at NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General at that time, got it. The current Secretary General, Mark Rutte, gets it. But this ability to be really, very personal with Donald Trump and call him up and say, hey, Donald, we need to talk. And I think that is going on a very regular basis. Now, we saw it after the Alaska summit, when all the European leaders who were relevant to making a difference to the president's thinking got on a plane immediately and came to Washington on that occasion. And by the way, the Finnish president, President Stubb, seems to have a very good relationship with Donald Trump, partially because he learned to play golf when he was in an American university. And so he's played golf with the president. That makes a big difference. And of course, Finland, being in such an important place as a new member of NATO and also right on the borders of Russia, is in a particular position, I think, to influence the president at this moment, as small as the country is. And President Stubbs said on that occasion, "You may wonder why I'm in this room with all these high-powered leaders from bigger countries in Europe." He said it jokingly, but I think his particular position is linked to his good relationship with the president. They play golf together, and Finnish geostrategic positioning and where it has been for its entire history in terms of trying to influence to the positive the events in Ukraine.
Wonderful. I see that we do have some questions coming in on the chat, which is great. Please continue sending them in. Rose, I was going to say, if ping pong played a role in the Cold War, as we know it did, so-called ping pong diplomacy, opening the relationship to China back in the 1970s, perhaps golf is, the version of that for 2024, 2025. Pavlo, in turning back to you, I want to quote Rose to you, characterizing the Ukrainian position as grounded in the will to survival. I don't think that you'll disagree with that, but I did want you to ask you to elaborate what you understand the Ukrainian position to be at the present moment. I can say in Washington that there is a kind of debate about whether this whole episode of the last 7 to 10 days was pushed from the Ukrainian side because there's a change in Ukrainian calculus. And there are, persuasive arguments on both sides of that in Washington. So we'd like to ask you about where Ukraine stands at the present moment, and ask as well about Europe. A moment ago, you described the European position as inclining in the right direction, but too slow and fragmented. So I'd just like to ask you to elaborate on those 2 points: the current Ukrainian position and the current European position.
Well, thanks. I'm kind of relaxed to hear that golf is a ping pong of the 21st century. I played a bit of golf when I've been posted to London, so it's it's kind of inspiring. Anyway, on our motivation is pretty clear. It's really not just survival of Ukraine as a country, but and as a nation. It's about retaining our sovereignty, because the moment our sovereignty could be cut off, it would be kind of precedent for everyone. For me, it's gonna open up completely different dimension of proliferation, because who could be sure that somebody's sovereignty could not be cut off in one of the most important dimensions? It would be about fundamentally different sense of what deterrence in the 21st century actually means. But in our case, it's also about Ukraine belonging to Europe, to the space of values we believe we share. And we also showed that we can fight for it. It's not just kind of statement. It's just a statement of who we are, and it's how Ukrainians understand it. If you talk to them, and not just to someone from a kind of political establishment, if you talk to Ukrainians, it's not considered like a slogan. And secondly, apart from sovereignty, it's of course about our identity. And you remember of the famous Putin's article denying our identity, saying that Ukraine actually does not exist as such. Ukrainian language does not exist. Ukrainian history is actually Russian history. and Ukrainian statehood is something like a joke, and so on and so on. And what is interesting, I've just seen the new numbers from kind of representative poll actually last week here in Ukraine. And only 4% of Ukrainians said they could consider renewing relations with Russia in the future, even after a ceasefire. Just 4%. And what is interesting, more people, around 11%, said very honestly that they use actually Russian as a main language. And it's, for me, quite a good argument for those who believe there is kind of Ukrainian Ukraine and there is kind of Russian Ukraine. Somehow Russian Ukraine, where mentality is different, where people speak Russian. And I've been around too many Ukrainian cities in the east and in the south, like Kharkiv, Dnipro, Odessa. And I could say that even people who use Russian in a kind of normal life, they can't imagine now go back under kind of Russian bubble. It's what you hear from people, not from someone from bureaucracy or from military, but from very, very, very normal people, and I'm very proud of that. I mean, even personally. So in our calculations, it's of course to retain our sovereignty to the degree we can. We are honest on sort of saying that we can't regain all the occupied territories right now, but we can't by no means accept and recognize these occupied territories as Russian ones. It's not just a red line. It's something which is fundamentally not supported by the absolute majority of Ukrainians, and you see it in any opinion poll. We can't say we will limit our defense capabilities because, of course, we rely on our partners and friends, but we have to rely on ourselves, on our capabilities and our capacity to deter Russia. Of course, we can say that someone should limit our foreign policy choices, and I'm 100% sure that saying they are against NATO, Moscow in the same time is against our EU membership, because if you remember 2013 and 2014 and how Maidan had started, in this time we were legally, but not only legally, but constitutionally so-called non-bloc country. And it did not help us in any way, because Russia started invading firstly the Crimea and after that Donbass. And I don't believe that neither Putin nor somebody in Russia kind of believe in any sort of guarantees, and in such guarantees, especially under current reality. But it's also about our ways of deciding what is important for us and what is important for Ukraine, and all the ideas to recognize Russian as official. So, and you can come to Kiev and hear that some people use Russian kind of totally freely, and nobody is freaking out about that. So it's a kind of reality we live, and it's all on fine. But to project the Russian world as a system of influencing Ukraine and subjugating Ukraine is a non-goal. And it's a clear non-go for the absolute majority of Ukrainians. It's more or less to describe what is critically important for Ukraine, discussing so-called points or whatever you call them. Turning to Europe, I believe there is a fundamental leap in how Europe now sees the reality, and I fully agree with Rose on that. Sometimes it's a lack of political will or ability to act boldly. For example, I'm not a big fan of the way how Europe reacted to this. How many? 28 points with this counter proposal, and I'm not sure I like all the points in this counter proposals. Now it's back to working with the U.S. administration, and I like it. But what I would have done if I could talk, having European credentials, I would say the whole point about the future is about security guarantees or bold security arrangements. And in the case of any sort of reaction by the Europeans, I would have said to the US president and US administration, look, we are now ready to consider legally binding or binding security guarantees. It's our commitment. Can you and would you go along with us? Because such security guarantees would be a game changer for Ukraine and for us. And there were messages from the US administration to Europe on sanctions on India, on China, linked with the purchasing of Russian oil. And here Europe could have returned actually this message and saying we could go as bold and ambitious as possible together on security guarantees. And it what fundamentally is lacking for me in European position. But it's not the end of the road. We need to pull off more here. And what is important, and I hear it from many Europeans, they got the very clear point that now it's not just about us, it's about them, it's about Europe, it's about European security. And it's not just acceptable or even relevant that someone would sort out European security over their heads. It's what Europeans are saying now in a clear way. And secondly, Europeans now understand it's about more investments in security and not just money. It's also about changing mentality, because the point I keep making to them, look, guys, if you produce just a bit more and sophisticated weapons, it's not what could deliver on your security. You still need people who want to fight for your way of life and for your values. And it's what fundamentally lacking in Europe, and we need to change it.
It's a very helpful segue, Pavlo, to turn back to Rose and to the next question that I want to ask of you both, but to pose it first to Rose, and I'll put it in the following terms about sticking points, challenges, difficulties that are preventing a negotiated solution to this conflict at the present moment. I'll just repeat what Pavlo said a moment ago, that a sort of European unwillingness or inability at the present moment to provide a credible security guarantee for Ukraine, I think that would qualify as a sticking point. I can think of many others to add to the mix, but I would first like to get you to comment on Pavlo's point about this aspect of the European approach, and then I'm sure you have other sticking points for us to consider at the present moment.
Right. Well, first, I did want to comment. I just read this morning, and it's early morning here in California, so maybe I haven't covered all the news, but I just read this morning that Vladimir Putin has signed a decree in which he has said that he wants to see 95% of those living in the 4 eastern provinces of Ukraine, which of course he claims as Russian territory, must be embracing Russian civic identity by 2036, meaning Russian language, of course, but also the notion of being Russian, not Ukrainian. And I think that's just a perfect illustration of what Pablo was talking about, that there is this deep chasm, at least between the Kremlin and Ukraine in its goals and objectives here. And indeed, Putin obviously does not believe that Ukraine does have a separate identity and the people there should have a separate identity, just doesn't believe it. And so I was quite struck by that when I read it this morning. So on to your question, this whole question of security guarantees, Pablo and I have been wrestling with this issue for 30 years, and so we know it very, very well. And I really wanted to emphasize that one of the more positive aspects I've seen of the 28-point plan was that the United States has now itself taken as its own the notion that it would participate in security guarantees. That was one of the weaknesses that we've been dealing with over the past 6 months, 6 to 9 months, and that is that the Europeans were expected to shoulder more of the responsibility. Trump was saying no U.S. troops in Ukraine, this force that the Europeans were trying to put together to provide for security to Ukraine and help to bolster the Ukrainian position. They were not going to be supported really by U.S. participation in the way that would show U.S. commitment to the process. I don't know what those security guarantees mean yet and how they will be defined, but the notion that the United States would be more directly involved in participating in them, I think, is an important point and needs to be fleshed out. It needs to be developed. Now, other aspects of the plan that I found very weird indeed was the notion that NATO itself would never agree to Ukraine becoming a member. And that would require a change in the basic document underlying the NATO alliance, that is the Washington Treaty of 1949, wherein it stated that NATO can accept and will accept new members if they desire to join, and NATO member states invite them to join, and there's a consensus decision. All of these are difficult hoops to jump through, and Ukraine, of course, would have to achieve consensus for its eventual NATO membership, but its membership is still very much on the table from the perspective of NATO. So the notion that somehow the basic foundational treaty of NATO would change to exclude membership of Ukraine or any other country in Europe. I have to stress that the members of NATO are in Europe or in North America. So it's that was a very strange aspect of the whole thing. And I seem to understand that has now been adjusted because the European leaders have been expressing now new satisfaction with the way it appears. The other major issue was that somehow the Trump administration would take over the sovereign wealth funds of Russia that are being held mostly in Europe, mostly in Belgium, and that is the sticking point now, that the Belgians have been wanting some assurances that if somehow the war ends and Russia seeks some kind of answer to why its assets are being frozen in this way, that Belgium itself would become subject to financial pressure and paying monies back to Russia. So the Europeans are trying to put together a major loan, a massive loan to Ukraine, which I think is important, based on those frozen Russian assets, and still negotiating with Belgium over it. But I think that is something that needs to continue to stay on its current track. I hope the Europeans can get that loan agreed, but it's not going to go into some kind of investment fund that the United States will control. And as the original points were written, would gain 50% of the benefits from those investments. So that was also a very strange aspect. There are many others, but those are the two that really jumped out at me. And the fact that Ukraine, according to the Russian U.S. I will say the U.S.-Russian plan, would also have to change its constitution so as not to join NATO. That really runs against the whole European focus on countries being able to choose for themselves not only their security relationships, but their economic and political relationships as well.
I want to take, Rosa's thoughts and sort of present them to you, Pavlo, for your response and your commentary. I did want to add in two other things to potentially comment on for both of you, if you wish, when it comes to sticking points. And this, to me, is a seeming overemphasis in what I can read into the 28-point plan, an overemphasis on territory as the crux of this conflict, that there's a difference about framing this as a conflict about territory and as a conflict about sovereignty. And I think territory is in some respects simpler than sovereignty, but that's, sort of perhaps one thing to bring as well into the mix. And then also, since we are speaking to, sort of practitioners as well as thinkers and scholars with the two of you, would like to ask a bit about process. And it does seem to me that if there's going to be a successful negotiation, there has to be an equal weight to the participants. So it cannot be just a U.S.-Russian process. And the process, just editorialize for a moment, I think has to be slower than what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, that to kind of rush documents into the public eye and then to kind of define what the terms are doesn't seem correct to me. It seems like the process should move more slowly. But if you could comment in addition to what Rose just said a moment ago, Pavlo, in terms of sticking points, and if you wish to comment on territory and process as part of it, the floor is now yours.
Yeah, one point, and consider it probably is a bit of irony, is that I could accept the idea of an investment fund if it's a kind of investment in Ukrainian defense, and only in Ukrainian defense. If it's about that, and if the frozen Russian assets partially used for that, under kind of understandable set of rules for us, for the Americans, and for Europe, but not the way how it had been put out in this point, it would be quite an interesting development. Just to use frozen assets for strengthening our defense in the future, not just in the sense of weapons supplies, but also in the sense of logistics and all kind of stuff. Of course, it could not be a sort of point which should be just agreed with Moscow, but it should be kind of point agreed with us and with the European Union. So on territory, of course, for us, our land is sacred. It's not just on political point. It's also a very emotional one. It goes through all our history, whether ancient or medieval history. And owning land was always critical for any Ukrainian. So land is something we feel really attached to. It's in our DNA, it's in our songs, so it's also emotionally important. But for Russia, especially for the Russian leadership, it's kind of a personal issue because the whole narrative, the whole mythology, why the war had started. And in Russian mythology, it had started about Donbass. Does not make sense if Russia can take the whole Donbass back, and any sort of other result will be seen at least by the majority of the Russians as a direct defeat. Secondly, I believe this issue is personally important for Vladimir Putin because he probably believes he should be measured not just in current context, but also in a kind of historical context with other personalities who are important for the Russian history, like Peter of the First or whoever, Catherine the Great, and all of them were able to get some additional land for the Russian Empire through different wars. And here, not to have even imaginal result of that will be seen as a fundamental failure. It's how I understand part of the Russian leadership motivation. So it's a narrative, it's a personal motivation, but also the desire, like Rose has just mentioned, sort of create Russia there. So should totally change mentality and traditions under pressure, and to try to do more or less the same what the Russian Empire and Soviet Union had been trying to do, but failed. So it's a kind of attempt to eradicate anything in the sense of Ukrainian mentality on the occupied territories. And we've been following all kind of attempts ongoing now, not only in the sense of giving Russian documents to everybody, but the whole propaganda in kindergartens, in schools, wherever, everybody. And it's also about resettling people from Russia to the occupied territory and the other way around. So basically changing the whole way where people live and where they used to live. On other points, yes, the point about NATO is for me a sort of weird one because NATO has to change the whole logic of its existence, not just found in documents. And if NATO is not an open structure for those who want to join it on the basis of common values and common goals, the whole logic of NATO is for me denied. So what Russia has been trying to do is to tell NATO, now you have to change the whole modus operandi of NATO, and to decide basically what NATO is and what NATO is not. And if the West and NATO would be willing to accept it, for me, it would be a fundamental sign of weakness, not just for the European members of NATO, but also for the US leadership. And it's important that everybody in DC clearly understands it. whatever sense about NATO and NATO future somebody can or can have. So it's also about a number of other points, and now they let me put it this way, kind of politically correct ones. The points are sort of being corrected in the sense both in substance and in form. But it's critically important that these points are not seen as restraining our sovereignty and denying identity, because I believe that accepting this would be a major sign of weakness by the West itself, and kind of sign of redefining Europe on the basis of Russian pressure. So basically, Europe would say, okay, and now it's about our conversation with Russia, which would define us and European security, something which would lead us back, and it's pretty close to you, Michael, as a historian, to a kind of Vienna Congress or something like that, where key powers in Europe of the 19th century actually decided to have a balance and decided to have spheres of influence and to sort of interact about these spheres of influence. And if we accept it, we are pretty much nowhere on the European security. It does not exclude a kind of critical dialogue with Russia on European security. But there should not be any sort of veto right by Russia on how Europe and NATO operate. Otherwise, I believe we are pretty much nowhere.
Rose, I want to turn back to you with the question about process and offer a hypothesis here just for your consideration, that so far on the US side, there have been 3 phases or 3 chapters of approaching the situation. The first, and I think the Vance conversation is in some complicated way a part of this. The first is where the US tries to change from being what it was under the Biden administration to a quote unquote honest broker, sort of in between Russia and Ukraine, and not siding with Ukraine, not siding with Russia, but sort of a neutral party. That I think didn't work out particularly well or didn't yield results. And then I think President Trump turned to summitry of a very dramatic nature. And there was the meeting in Alaska, which, at the time, before it happened, people speculated could be a kind of breakthrough or a big change. That also yielded very little or almost nothing in return. And now we've come to the third phase of the third chapter, which is sort of the age of the special envoy, where the key actor is Steve Witkoff, or perhaps Steve Witkoff plus Jared Kushner, and sort of a new figure, the Army Secretary from the Pentagon. I think his first name is Dan. I know his last name is Driscoll, who are now operating as sort of envoys and working not at the presidential level, but below that level to try to generate some kind of change. And if I could just ask you to comment on this as a matter of process. I mean, there seems to be just a continuous search for process on the part of the White House, and would be curious to get your thoughts about this.
Well, I think you're glamorizing what's been going on as a process. My understanding of what happened in Washington when this whole story started to break last week was people had no idea across the government in the different departments, and even people inside the White House were quite surprised and confused by this 28-point plan suddenly appearing. It does seem to point to the fact that the Vice President, J.D. Vance, has decided to take an interest in this. He is apparently good friends with Dan Driscoll, and they get along very well together. And so he brought Dan Driscoll into the play. And so I do think, maybe not so much a process as a diplomatic rugby match is going on with a lot of pushing and shoving But it's also clear to me that the Secretary of State, Mr. Rubio, basically reestablished his position this week, taking command of an important phase in the talks. And so that too is important. But the other thing I wanted to take exception with, Michael, is the notion that Russia, that the Trump administration ever wanted to play a kind of honest broker here, at least in an early phase. I think that the president, already having established, as he considers it, a good working relationship and friendship, even with Vladimir Putin, he likes to repeat that he's friends with Vladimir Putin. And he famously boasted that he could get this done in one day when he was on his campaign trail. But that also points to the other piece of this, that he has excoriated the Biden administration approach of not communicating with Russia, of simply cutting them off, and really taking a very strict and strong position opposing what the Kremlin was doing. I agreed with the Biden approach, and I thought it was a masterful game of deterrence in how the Biden administration was operating and ensuring that in fact Russia did not spill over into NATO territory, but NATO was allowed and really able to continue to support Ukraine throughout. That now we're seeing the spillover with these drone incursions into NATO territory, but being able to supply Ukraine through all those early years of the war was very, very important and essential. So coming in now, obviously the Trump team and Mr. Trump himself wanted to cut back on U.S. assistance getting into Ukraine, getting the Europeans to pay for armaments, et cetera, but never, in my view, was there this notion of being an honest broker. It was always the carrots for the Kremlin and the sticks for Kyiv. Now, it does seem to be changing somewhat in that there's a recognition that carrots and sticks have to be applied to both sides. At least I hope that's what we're seeing in this phase of the negotiations. And furthermore, there does seem to be, at least at the moment, some momentum behind the set of envoys who are working this issue. I don't know Dan Driscoll, but he seems to have been able to play an effective role. I think it's also important that we've seen some very what I would call strong actors on the Ukrainian side. The fact that Kirill Budanov, for example, was in Abu Dhabi, very important figure in the security services of Ukraine. And so there are strong and influential players on different sides of this, and we'll see what the result is. But honestly, I will just mention the role of other countries here. We've had Abu Dhabi, the Gulf states have been playing these kinds of balancing roles, facilitator roles in a lot of different talks, but also Turkey has been playing an interesting facilitator role here. And I do think that has been an important source of momentum as well, to have different countries engaged and involved, in addition to the European members of NATO, the big countries like UK, France, and Germany. We've had other countries involved. I mentioned Finland a while ago, but I do think that the role of these different countries has been important also. But in terms of process, I'm not sure I'd describe it in quite the organized way you did, Michael. It's been much more of a scrum from my perspective.
Yeah, I was doing my best to provide an orderly overview of what has been, often very, very difficult to read in real time. To stick with you for one further question, Rose, which I'll then turn and pose to you, the same question to you, Pavlo, and it's sort of implicit in some of what you've been saying, but I want to try to tease it out a little bit more. I think the three of us could probably agree that the process as it exists now has yielded very little in terms of any kind of sustainable, agreement, negotiation. And I think the two of you have offered many reasons why that's the case. And so my question to you, Rose, at the moment is, what might get this unstuck? Would it be a move from the U.S.? Would it be a willingness in the Kremlin to change the fundamental calculus? Would it be a kind of strengthening of the European position, as Pavlo was describing, the recognition that this is existential for Europe as well, and the willingness to invest? I think that one can ask the question about Ukraine, but I suspect that Ukraine is going to continue doing what it's doing. It's not going to make a fundamental change. But what could get what could get this unstuck? What could yield, and it could be 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, some kind of result that would be more tangible than what we've seen over the past 8, 9 months?
I actually think we are in a new phase of this negotiation in the last couple of days, and I'd like to hear what Pavlo has to say about this. But the fact that the Ukrainian team agreed in principle to this pared down plan, and also that so far anyway, I always think that effective negotiations, to be effective, have to take place behind closed doors. And the fact that so far these talks in the last couple of days have been kept confidential. We don't know exactly how this 28-point plan has been changed so that Ukraine has been able to say they agree in principle. Now it has to be sold to the man in the Kremlin, and Steve Witkoff is due to go off to Moscow next week to talk to him about it. We'll see what happens, but it seems to me that we are in a new and more serious stage of the negotiations now. So I don't agree 100%, Michael, that no progress has been made, and particularly in the last few days, it seems to me that that there has been some important movement. All have been participating. The Europeans, obviously, with their attempt at putting their own plan on the table, but now they seem to be working with the Ukrainians and Americans on what has become, I guess, a 19-point plan at this point. But in any event, I am assuming for the Ukrainians to be able to say that they are willing to, in principle, accept the current version means that there has been progress on those important issues that Pavlo has been raising about the territorial situation particularly, but also in other important areas such as eventual NATO membership.
There's a joke about Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points that God had only 10 commandments, but Woodrow Wilson had 14 points. But we've doubled the number of points in the interim to 28. Pavlo, let's turn back to you for thoughts about what may be changing at the present moment or becoming unstuck in the negotiations. And I can ask the question also hypothetically, what would have to become unstuck for these negotiations to move forward in some dramatic way?
I don't believe that neither the President Trump nor the U.S. administration, and like Rose has said, I mean here the position of the whole administration. And all the key decisions, of course, will be taken by the president, but still it's about kind of clear-cut position, what kind of terms could be agreed with Russia. First, we clearly understand that the ongoing negotiations is not just about us, it's not just about Ukraine. There are other issues in US-Russian agenda. Secondly, I don't believe that the US president is willing to come to the Russian terms and to agree something on the Russian terms, because it would show US and him personally as in a sort of weird position, and bluntly saying it, quite weak. Third, I believe that we have kind of new momentum in negotiations, although kind of messy ones, with different moves. And again, if we believe we had roller coaster in these 9 months, now it's a real one, kind of Disneyland style, the toughest one, in the sense of emotions, but also in the sense of everybody engaging with everybody. Fourth, I believe that potentially the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil can play a role, because, I mean, technically, there is always a time lag of 6 to 10 weeks before any sort of new contracts should be should be sorted off. So the results of these sanctions, even signaling results, will be felt probably somewhere at the end of winter. I mean, somewhere around February or March. I don't believe the Chinese would limit their oil supplies, but on the Indian side, it's a real impact. And I also believe that the recent conversations, let's call them conversations, between the President Trump and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, both personal and phone conversations could have played a role, because it's the first time I saw the Chinese stating that both talked about Ukraine in a kind of direct way in their press releases. And I understand the Chinese do care about what's going to happen, because they see Russia as a sort of asset, geopolitically, but also economically. They do understand about that their relations to Europe are important to them, not just in economic sense. And they do understand that they probably don't care really too much, let me say it in a bit of ironic way, about us, but they definitely care about this war and its consequences. So any kind of conversation and any kind of, let's call it, understanding between US and China on this war could zoom in possibilities for the future. On the top of that, it's also about how Europe and US coordinate not just new sanctions and possible new sanctions, but especially their implementation. Because we have so many sanctions, and a lot of them should have been quite effective. But because of all kinds of gaps in their implementation, they were not, and they are not. But they could become far more effective even short term. So it's, not exhaustive, but still a kind of range of factors which could lead us to sustaining this tricky momentum we are having now.
Oh, thank you so much. Let me collate two questions from our audience and offer it to you for concluding remarks. Both questions happen to be about President Trump. We'll start with you, Pavlo, and then Rose will conclude today's conversation with your thoughts. One question from JD Bindenagel about how much power the U.S. has to coerce outcomes in Ukraine that Ukraine might, not be willing to or not eager to accept, especially on the economic side, about sort of elements that were there in the 28-point plan. So sort of coercive power of the United States in the context of these negotiations. And then Jill Doherty asks about Trump threatening to walk away at times and what that might look like if it were to happen. So Pavlo, let's start with you about, sort of coercive power of the U.S. and Trump's occasional threats to walk away. And then we'll turn to you, Rose, for final thoughts.
I'd say yes, this coercive power is there. We need U.S. support, military support, we need weapons supplies, we need intel, we need logistics, and a lot of stuff where Europe can't substitute the U.S., at least now and at least tomorrow. Yes, it's also about economic stuff, but for me, this coercive power is mainly on the side of security assistance, which is critical for us. Having said that, I don't believe that somebody could push us in accepting something which is existential for Ukraine, which is about, I mean, our our existence, and it's about our sovereignty, and which would what could give Russia a sort of dominating position over Ukraine, and what could give Russia all the trumps to attack again. So in this sense, I believe that we can't we really can go for it, even with creative pressure. In the sense of I mean, what would follow, and whether it's kind of fundamental point for us in how to build further negotiations. I believe the President Trump can't afford simply to turn away from this war, because it's now something which is not a kind of political point. It has become personal, and it's a point of his personal legacy. It's a point of his political legacy. It's a point of respect for him, because he promised a number of times to sort it out in 24 hours, in 3 months, in 6 months, whatever. It's, I mean, different time frames. But what I feel, maybe I'm wrong here, I believe that mentioning all these wars, 8 wars, or I forgot how many, the President Trump keeps saying he was able to end. I believe that for him, is just Middle East and Ukraine. What's kind of personal, and what would give him a sense that he would be able to deliver on something really important. So it's a sort of personal point for him, and not just a political point. And simply to walk away under such circumstances would be seen again as weakness, and he can't afford it. It's at least my reading.
Yeah, I agree. If you look at the kind of track record of President Trump, there's often the threat to do that sort of thing, but actually walking away is not something that he typically does. Rose, let's turn to you on these 2 points, sort of coercive power of the U.S. and Trump's occasional threats to walk away, and get your thoughts.
Well, famously, in that horrible meeting in February that we started with, the president said to Zelensky, "You don't have any cards," and basically conveying that the United States and Russia has all the cards in this situation. But so obviously the United States has a great deal of coercive power, and Pavlo mentioned a number of things, but the sharing of intelligence information is very important. And after that February meeting, suddenly the United States suspended the sharing of intelligence information to Ukraine. And I think that dealt a very sharp shock, not only to the Ukrainians, but also to the NATO European colleagues who said, oh my, the United States could do the same to us. And you can see the stress and strain that has caused, including in some of our closest allies, the UK, for example. So I think these are very, important cards that the United States holds, and it's built on the U.S. Prowess across the board on defense, security, and intelligence, and that, as well as the wealth of the United States and the way it can impose the pressure of the dollar or not. I was very glad to see that the sanctions were finally laid on Gazprom and excuse me, Rosneft. I think that was an important stick finally getting applied on Moscow. So, but perhaps I'll end by just stressing that I think there's a sea change going on now in the negotiations, also because all three of the main leaders, the main players, are under some significant pressure that has gained force. President Zelensky has had to address this corruption scandal, this terrible corruption scandal, and I was glad to see that the independent authorities, anti-corruption authorities in Ukraine, were able to step forward with a great deal of public support and continue with the investigation. But that has really shaken confidence in Zelensky's administration and in the president himself. So he's under pressure. He needs to deliver something. In Moscow, interestingly, not only are there these sanctions, I think, coming to begin to bite, but also the fact that Putin has had to raise taxes. He's obviously under some economic pressure as well, and the VAT tax will be raised by 2 percentage points. And the Russian media has been careful to try to portray this as, again, not his fault. Don't mention President Putin when you talk about raising taxes. This is all the fault of the Europeans. This is all the fault of NATO that we've had to raise taxes. But obviously there are gathering economic pressures on the Russians as well. And in the case of Mr. Trump, he's had a horrible month. The election, the by-election, or wasn't really midterm, but special elections in November of this year produced some really startling wins for the Democrats that showed a supreme critique of the Trump administration and what the president has been doing so far. And so I think that these kinds of lessons have started to pile on the American president as well. And so he's been feeling some stresses and strains and wants another big win to go along with his Gaza ceasefire and the delivery of the Israeli hostages back to their families. So he wants another big win in that way. So I think we've got pressure on all three main leaders now. And let's see if the momentum can continue in these negotiations in the coming days.
Well, Rose, Pavlo, from California, from Kiev, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so proud at the Kennan Institute to have you on our advisory council, and we hope this will be the first of many such conversations. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
You're very welcome, and great to see you, Pavlo. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yeah, great to see Olga, and thanks for this great conversation.
Thanks so much to you both.
Thank you.